Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the programme. Our top stories. Frantic rescue efforts in China after the country's deadliest earthquake in years. More than 120 people have now been killed. Our other headlines, more sanctions on Russia from the European Union, but Moscow says they'll find ways around them. Ukraine welcomes that latest announcement. President Zelensky says it will truly reduce Russia's military power. And the United Nations Security Council is set to vote on a ceasefire in Gaza, but the new draft text has reportedly been watered down to try to get backing from the United States. It's China's deadliest earthquake in 13 years, with a death toll that is expected to rise significantly. So far, at least 126 people are known to have died in the magnitude 6.2 quake, which struck the mountainous northwestern province of Gansu overnight. Snow, along with temperatures of minus 15 degrees, have made the conditions extremely difficult in what is one of China's least accessible and poorest rural communities. Rescue teams have been sent to the area and evacuation camps have now been set up. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Guo Tianxu, who's arrived at the biggest evacuation camp in Jiashan County. Well, first of all, you're there. Just how extensive is the damage from what you can see?
Yes, well, we are here at the Dahe village resettlement site, the biggest resettlement site here in the Dahe Jia town. And there are, here are more than 100 tents that providing shelters for about 900 survivors. And also, in the early morning, the experts say that the vast majority of the trapped personnel have already evacuated and founded. So their main task is conducting the carpet searching, which means they will go inside every collapsed household to find survivors. And their main task right now is to relocate the personnel and help them to save their belongings and their livestock. And right now, there are about 1,400 firefighters, 1,000 police officers, 1,000 armed police are at the epicenter, and more than 30 unofficial troops are already here helping them to deliver some daily necessities. Also, there is medical field hospital here that can provide the preliminary screening of the patients. So I also talked to some survivors living here in the resettlement tent. They told me last night they spent all night long in the outside holding their children. They feel very cold, but tonight they think they can have a better night.
Time is obviously passing. It looks extremely cold there. I mean, what's the latest on the rescue operation?
Yes, here is on the border of the Tibetan Plateau and the Lhotse Plateau, so it belongs to high altitude area. Right now, the temperature in the night can be minus 16 degrees Celsius, and right now it's at least minus 8 degrees Celsius, but the temperature in the tent is bearable because they're using the winter type tents. It's very thick, and people are allocated with some warm clothes, some warm quilts and beddings, and also every tent is equipped with a heating stove. Also, I talked to some the family living in this tent, and they say we can take a brief look inside. Hi, 您好，您好。只想问一下这个炉子怎么样？帐篷里面的温度您觉得怎么样 ？How's the temperature here inside the tent?
温度 差不多有20几、22度啊，特别温暖。
Thank you. 谢谢. So they say the temperature inside the tent is about 21 degrees Celsius, so it's quite warm, and their children is sleeping. And apart from that, although this is in the resettlement site, it's not very hard to find a hot meal because the field kitchen belongs to the police officers. They are cooking hot Muslim meals and steamed rice for the local people, and there are volunteer catering groups. They are making the beef noodles on site for the survivors here living here. Back to you.
Guo Tianqi, thank you for that. We'll check in with you in the coming hours, but for the moment, our correspondent Guo Tianqi in China. Russia says it'll find ways of circumventing the latest sanctions by the European Union. A $60 cap on Russian oil prices will be more strictly enforced, while there's a new ban on liquefied gas exports and trading restrictions on Russian diamonds. The sanctions were approved after Austria lifted its objections, which were linked to Ukraine's blacklisting of an Austrian bank accused of maintaining ties with Moscow. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova, watching events for us in Moscow. Dasha, what more has the Kremlin said about this new legislation from the EU?
Well, indeed, Moscow was expecting the 12th package of the EU sanctions against Russia, and the Kremlin spokesman has said that the sanctions potential of the European Union is exhausting itself, given what sanctions have been introduced. Now, when you look at this package, it's particularly focusing on the ban on the imports of Russian diamonds that are coming from the mining in Russia and Russia's Alrosa company in particular. We understand that with regard to that, Moscow says it can circumvent those sanctions. By that meaning, of course, that Russia used to use Antwerp, the city in Belgium, as the main gateway to the diamond world. This is where those diamonds were sold to India primarily, because we understand that most of the diamonds are being polished and cut in India. So now, from the perspective here in Moscow, Moscow will be using other trade diamond brokers and other diamond exchanges instead of those in Europe, turning to the UAE or Israel, for instance. With regard to other sanctions, we understand they are also focusing on circumventing, on tightening the control on the sanctions implementation, not to allow Russia to circumvent. This is with regards to the cap on Russian oil, oil and gas resources. With regard to that, Moscow has long been saying that it is not going to sell its energy resources at this mechanism of price cap. So certainly Russia is certain that it can find the ways to circumvent those sanctions, but particularly Moscow is saying that in any situation the Russian economy has shown some growth in 2023 instead of crippling as it was expected.
Vladimir Putin has again said that Russia is prepared to talk to Ukraine with a long list of conditions which would be unacceptable, presumably, to Ukraine. But the diplomatic efforts on this conflict continue, don't they, with the Russian Prime Minister in Beijing meeting the Chinese Premier?
Well, that's right. The Russian president has been addressing the military chiefs, and he reasserted that Russia's goals in so-called special military operation have not changed. He once again blamed the Western countries for failing to understand Russian concerns, for encroaching on the Russian borders. So the Russian president has reasserted that Moscow has never closed the door towards the possibility of negotiations. Having said that, Moscow does insist that now, after almost 2 years into the so-called special military operation in Ukraine, those talks will have to take place on the terms that Russia has and the realities on the ground. By that meaning that Russia has 4 new territories within its borders, as Moscow has reasserted. But obviously the diplomatic effort here has never exhausted its potential. We understand Moscow has been talking to several partners on the possibility of resuming those negotiations, and obviously the issue of Ukraine is one of those that is present at had many negotiations with the Russian officials, and now the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin is in Beijing for talks with his Chinese counterpart and also for talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. All those negotiations are focusing on bilateral cooperation, but the situation in Ukraine is something that is obviously on the minds of many interlocutors of Moscow.
Dasha, thank you for that. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova with The View from Moscow. Let's talk now to our correspondent Megumi Lim, who's in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. Megumi, what response in Ukraine to these new sanctions from the European Union?
Well, of course, this decision was very much welcomed by people here in Ukraine and, of course, by President Zelensky himself. It will make it harder for Russia to evade sanctions as it did this year. As Dasha mentioned earlier, the Russian economy was able to bounce back instead of being crippled by the sanctions that were previously imposed against them. And this decision comes at quite a timely time as Ukraine is struggling to get more funding from its Western partners, and it is becoming more apparent that the war between Ukraine and Russia is not ending anytime soon. U.S. officials have said that existing funds for Ukraine is running dry, that it will soon announce its latest round of a military aid package for Ukraine, but this will be the last one if Congress doesn't approve the latest round of a military aid package, aid and funding for Ukraine. And ammunition is running dry for Ukraine as well, and there are a lot of concerns for Ukrainian troops on the battlefield. So it is very important for Ukraine that there are measures to help cripple Russia's ability to replenish its war chest, as the war will soon enter into its third year next year. And so today, President Zelensky thanked Ukraine's European partners for adopting this latest round of sanctions. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
It is important that for the first time a ban on Russian diamonds has been introduced. There are new measures against the circumvention of sanctions and the supply of goods and technologies of dual use to Russia. There are new restrictions on imports from Russia. All of this will truly help reduce the economic foundation of the war. And we'll continue to work with our partners to ensure that the sanctions imposed by Europe work globally.
So again, this is a very important decision by the EU. Also, as I mentioned, Ukraine's Western partners are struggling to get more funding for Ukraine, not only the United States, but also the EU, as Hungary has continued to block the EU's proposal to send 50 billion euros in military aid and financial assistance to Ukraine for the next 4 years. So there's a lot hanging in the balance as, again, the war will soon enter into its third year. There's a lot of concerns surrounding funding and how Ukraine will approach its military operations in the coming year.
Megumi, thank you for that. Our correspondent Megumi Lim in Ukraine. Recently announced talks on EU membership for both Ukraine and Moldova will need to address the rather thorny issue of economic integration. Agricultural imports from Ukraine into Poland have resulted in a blockade of border crossings by lorry drivers and farmers. Our correspondent Peter Oliver reports.
On the European Union's eastern frontier with Ukraine, Polish truckers and farmers are blockading half of the border crossings. Over the access to the EU market, Brussels has already granted Kyiv. Farmers leading the blockade in this region in the east say that they are being squeezed out by grain from Ukraine that sells at around half the price of that produced in Poland.
The situation here is complicated, and the EU is constantly putting pressure on the grain to be poured in because, of course, we are the border zone. We are as close to Ukraine as possible, and Ukrainian trucks transported to our region. We ask for the grain to be transported in solidarity to Africa, to the countries of the Western EU, for the grain to be transported there and not to be floated on our local market because we can no longer make money.
Last year, Brussels authorized Ukrainian grain to be allowed into the EU through solidarity lanes. Ukrainian farmers do not have to adhere to EU regulations on things like wages and production. This means the Ukrainian produce hit Polish markets in this region at far lower prices. There is no quick fix to this. Blockade leaders say the last Polish government made them promises that they expect Donald Tusk's new administration to keep, including cash payments of around $255 per hectare of land owned.
What were the promises that you were made?
This is what we were promised. The first is simply compensation of 1,000 Polish zloty per hectare and 700 Polish zloty, depending on the region. The second is to restore credit and liquidity so we can take loans to stop farms from going under. And the third is not to increase the agricultural tax for farmers by 21%.
Support for Ukraine across Poland is incredibly high. However, those taking part in protests and blockades here say that support can't be at the expense of livelihoods.
Some of the things we've seen across agriculture and transport are unacceptable. We've suffered greatly. Some decisions were made hastily and farmers and haulage companies were affected. But throughout all this, we continue to support the Ukrainian people.
For now, the new Polish government has said it will keep limits on Ukrainian grain imports, a move Ukraine's Deputy Economy Minister Taras Kachka has called illegal and counterproductive. As Ukraine enters into formal negotiations to join the European Union, these are the issues that will need to be sorted out, which is much easier said than done. Peter Oliver, CGTN, the Polish-Ukrainian border.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the United Nations is set to vote on a ceasefire in Gaza. Will it get the backing of the United States, who have vetoed all previous attempts?
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us.
And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Frantic rescue efforts in China after the country's deadliest earthquake in years. More than 120 people have now been killed. Our other headlines, more sanctions on Russia from the European Union, but Moscow says they'll find ways around them. And Ukraine welcomes this latest announcement. President Zelensky says it'll truly reduce Russia's military power. The United Nations Security Council is set to vote on a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. A new draft text has reportedly been watered down from the word cessation to suspension of hostilities to get the backing of the United States, who have vetoed previous attempts. This as dozens of people have been killed in 3 Israeli strikes on residential buildings in Rafah. Palestinian authorities say the death toll in Gaza has reached almost 20,000 people. The United States has also raised concerns with Israel after a mother and daughter were allegedly killed in a sniper attack in a church compound in Gaza City. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Noor Harazin, who's in central Gaza. Noor, what more can you tell us on this?
Well, yes, intensive nights of Israeli airstrikes on the city of Rafah, which is located in southern Gaza. Actually, now Rafah is one of the most densely populated areas in southern Gaza, not only because the big number of its own residents, but also because of the big number of displaced people who left and evacuated their homes from northern Gaza and went to Rafah. The IDF have been talking over the past weeks about how Rafah is a safe area and people should be evacuating there. However, what we are witnessing here on the ground is that most of the Israeli bombings now in southern Gaza are happening in Rafah. The Israeli warplanes targeted the Al Auda Square, which is in the heart of the city of Rafah. It's a street that is full with shops and vendors. Dozens of people were killed. The Israeli warplanes attacked several residential homes, Abd al-Al home, Zu'rab home. 30 people were killed, including the Palestinian journalist Adel Zu'rab. And this brings up the death toll between Palestinian journalists here in Gaza since the 7th of October, up to 95 Palestinian journalists that were killed in Gaza. Talking also about the battles on the ground, there is intensive fighting in eastern Shija'iyya, also in eastern Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis now is like a battlefield between the Hamas fighters and the Israeli forces.
And aid groups have been voicing their anger over attacks on hospitals in Gaza.
Well, yes, I mean, over the past 48 hours, and we have been talking and reporting the continuous Israeli attacks and airstrikes on different hospitals around Gaza and northern Gaza and southern Gaza. Ashraf Al-Qudra, who is the spokesperson of the Palestinian Health Ministry here in Gaza, and in a statement just 2 hours ago, he said, and I quote, "We are surprised of the silence of the international community because this silence is giving the Israeli forces a green light to continue targeting the hospitals in Gaza." And this statement and other statements comes after an Israeli attack, two actually Israeli attacks on the Al-Shifa hospital, where 10 people were killed, including women and children. Also an Israeli attack on the Al-Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis, where a 13-year-old child was killed. Recently, this morning, the Israeli forces stormed into the Al Auda hospital, which is located in northern Gaza, and now the Al Auda hospital is like a closed Israeli military base. They also arrested a number of the medical staff. So yes, the Israeli attacks on hospitals here in Gaza continues, and all of this is happening while the hospitals are already suffering the lack of fuel, medicine, medical supplies, and also the unhealthy environment in the hospitals. I mean, the hospitals now in Gaza have turned into refugee camps to house hundreds and thousands, actually, of Palestinians who evacuated their homes over the past weeks.
Noor, thank you for that. Our correspondent Noor Harazin in Gaza. Well, let's get the view now from Israel and talk to our correspondent Trent Murray, who's watching events for us in Tel Aviv. Trent, the United States Defense Secretary has been meeting senior Israeli officials and some comments about a possible humanitarian pause.
Yeah, that's right, Jamie. Secretary Lloyd Austin flying into Israel as part of a wider tour of the region, and it was here that he said that the US would continue to offer unwavering support for Israel and its security, but he did also make the comment that he discussed with military officials when they would be looking to move away from high-intensity campaigns like we're seeing on the ground to ones that are more surgical, in the words of the Defence Secretary. He also also said that countries like Israel have a moral duty and a strategic imperative to try and protect civilians during warfare. But of course, we know the Israelis are not letting up in this military campaign to try and hunt down those Hamas fighters which orchestrated the October 7th attacks. On the issue of hospitals, we have seen videos and statements by the IDF where they say health facilities are being used in the Gaza Strip by Hamas fighters to coordinate on the ground. They've released video showing weapons like RPGs and assault rifles being stored at one clinic today. They also said they discovered an IED, unexploded explosive device, being hidden in a trash can within the hospital. But of course, that comes as the UN and the WHO does express concern and is calling for a ceasefire. I may just mention briefly on a ceasefire, if I could, Jamie, we've just had some comments released by President Herzog of Israel saying, I can reiterate the fact that Israel is ready for another humanitarian pause and additional humanitarian aid in order to release all of our hostages. He said, it is important for me to reiterate that we are not fighting the people of Gaza. They are not our enemies. We are fighting Hamas. He also mentions just briefly that they are dealing with humanitarian efforts, including the construction of foreign temporary hospitals, and he commended an initiative being led by the United Arab Emirates on that front. Jamie.
Trent, a quick word about the United States, perhaps set to lead a new security operation in the Red Sea after this series of maritime attacks.
Yeah, a major show of force by the United States Navy, joining the likes of France, Britain, Spain and others to try and secure those vital shipping lanes. They are absolutely crucial for connecting Europe with Asia. Around 12% of global trade traverses those waters off the Red Sea, but they have become quite unstable in recent weeks as Yemen-based Houthi rebels step up attacks on civilian shipping. That has led to a number of the world's biggest shipping companies to announce that they're going to avoid those waters, adding days and days to their journey going around the south of Africa instead. It would appear that this new operation, which is called Operation Prosperity Guardian, will see 10 nations, including the US, try to secure those vital shipping lines and protect cargo ships from those Houthi attacks.
Trent, back to you later in the day. For the moment, thank you. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Tel Aviv. The headlines again. Frantic rescue efforts in China after the country's deadliest earthquake in years. More than 120 people have now been killed. Our other headlines, more sanctions on Russia from the European Union, but Moscow says they'll find ways around them. And Ukraine welcomes this latest announcement. President Zelensky says it will truly reduce Russia's military power. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. We're back with more news at the top of this hour. Coming up next, it's World Insight. For now, from all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
This is CGTN, China Global Television.